Mr. Chairman, good afternoon again, and thank you for your invitation to testify about the Kelowna Independent Review's report on UNRWA. The Secretary General limited the review's mandate to UNRWA's neutrality, so the report does not discuss, let alone make any recommendations concerning many long-standing criticisms of UNRWA, two of which are particularly important and which I will mention. There are additional ones in my written testimony and in documents I have written over really the last 15 years. My original document on UNRWA was written in 2009 for the Washington Institute on Near East Policy, and that document, 15 years old, is still completely relevant because nothing has really changed. What the report doesn't address that I want to mention today is that firstly, that UNRWA should be using the UN Refugee Convention definition of a refugee, which provides that a person cannot be both a citizen under the protection of his state of residence and also a refugee at the same time. Adopting that definition would reduce UNRWA's claimed 5.9 million Palestine refugees by nearly a third. There are about 1.8 million of these oxymoronic citizen refugees in Jordan alone. All of this would save a considerable amount of funding. Secondly, UNRWA should be vetting its Palestine refugee beneficiaries, at least some of whose criminal histories would bar them from being considered refugees under the UN Refugee Convention. United States funds should not go to any Palestine refugee identified as supporting terrorism. The report itself, even though its recommendations were limited to aspects of neutrality, and even though, as we've heard from previous speakers, that the review group itself was not 100% neutral, the report still came up with 50 recommendations, the majority of which, by my own count, approximately 37, reflect obvious deficiencies, obvious management deficiencies, things that like the need for training, better coordination with other agencies, better enforcement of rules, employing more women as managers, things that any competent management team would have long ago addressed without prodding from an independent review. Some of those management deficiencies, and I'll mention two: the decision not to vet staff for terrorist connections when hiring or retaining them, and the decision not to remove anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and violence glorification from education materials. These items, these things I've mentioned, are in areas fundamental to the operation of any UN agency, or they should be. Moreover, these same issues have been brought to the attention of UNRWA's management repeatedly and over a period of literally decades. I was not the first person to write about some of these things, and I wrote 15 years ago. Yet these same deficiencies have remained unfixed, unattended to, and still had to be noted in the Kelowna Report. In short, the recommendations in the Kelowna Report reflect both a lack of competent management and a decades-long willful obstruction of some fundamental reforms. They thus constitute a damning indictment of UNRWA's current and past leadership. There is a remark in the report, which has been mentioned here already, that was made in passing and that led to a media misconception regarding certain Israeli allegations. The report specifically noted that Israel made public claims that a significant number of UNRWA employees in Gaza are members of terrorist organizations, but Israel has yet to provide supporting evidence of this. That quoted statement has been widely interpreted by the media to mean that UNRWA does not employ significant numbers of terrorists and/or terrorist supporters. That interpretation is certainly wrong. The Israeli accusations regarding the 13,000 or so UNRWA staff members in Gaza were that about 1,200 of them were Hamas members and about 6,000 of them were related to Hamas members. Those accusations actually ring true, given two well-known facts. Firstly, Hamas has significant support amongst the people of Gaza. For instance, a March 2024 poll by a reputed and well-reputed Palestinian pollster indicated that about 40 to 60% of Gaza residents are supportive of Hamas. Secondly, taking that pool of workers, for this is where UNRWA draws its employees in Gaza, UNRWA makes no effort to exclude from its hiring process persons with Hamas connections or sympathies. Other things being equal, from those two known facts, one could reasonably assume that approximately 40 to 60% of UNRWA's 13,000 Gaza employees are in fact supporters or members of Hamas, which is not that different from what the Israelis alleged. After the horrors of October the 7th, and the subsequent revelations concerning UNRWA staff participation in those horrors, the decades-long discussion about how can we finally force reforms on recalcitrant UNRWA has, in many cases, moved on to the question, do we really need such an incompetent and malfunctioning agency? Speaking directly to that subject, other speakers have mentioned, the Kelowna Report mirrors the views of UNRWA and the UN Secretary General, stating, in one case, UNRWA is irreplaceable and indispensable to Palestinians' human and economic development. It is simply not true that UNRWA is irreplaceable. In every UNRWA field of operation, the local authorities provide services, including things like health and education, to those of their residents who are not defined as Palestine refugees by UNRWA. These local authorities, if UNRWA's resources and responsibility for Palestine refugees were transferred to them, could simply expand their operations. If an adjustment period were necessary, other UN international and NGO organizations could provide temporary assistance with what were formerly UNRWA's responsibilities. The bottom line, UNRWA is replaceable, and given the Kelowna Report's revelations that UNRWA's leadership is both incompetent and willfully obstructionist of fundamental reforms, UNRWA should be replaced. There are only three ways to bring an end to UNRWA's operations. The General Assembly, which created UNRWA by a resolution, could officially end it the same way. As UNRWA is almost wholly financially dependent on donations from mostly Western governments, those donor governments could halt their funding. And thirdly, lastly, a host state, such as Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or Israel, could refuse UNRWA access to territory under its control. As a practical matter, we know the General Assembly will not take action to end UNRWA's mandate. But a halt in donor funding, combined with a refusal to allow UNRWA access to one or more of its fields of operation, would, as a practical matter, end UNRWA's mandate in those fields of operation. The current situation, in conclusion, is that the U.S. is prevented by law, as you've mentioned, Mr. Chairman, from donating funds to UNRWA until next March, and has been transferring aid funds to other international organizations in Gaza. And Israel seems to be decreasing UNRWA's access to Gaza in favor of other aid providers, such as the World Food Program. Thus, whether by design or by accident, at the moment, the U.S. and Israeli governments seem to be working together to accomplish a desirable outcome. A Gaza freed of terrorist control and a Gaza provided aid via organizations that are less likely to be compromised by terrorist-supporting employees. With that in mind, the U.S. halt to UNRWA funding should be extended beyond the present expiry date of 25 March 2025, with any U.S. aid to Gaza being delivered by other organizations. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to any questions you may wish to direct to me.
Mr. Lindsay, thank you so very much. And maybe I could just ask you, you were the general counsel, the top lawyer for UNRWA, and obviously you saw things that you didn't like, and now you are speaking out very powerfully against continuing funding to them. Maybe, especially so the record is clear, could you give us some insights as to what you saw that caused you to have a change of heart?
There were a number of things that occurred that concerned me. It mostly had to do with things, for instance, I remember being concerned about a requirement from the State Department. There is a Section 301C, which requires every year, or did when I was in Gaza anyway, a representation, a statement from UNRWA that it had done everything possible to avoid money being provided, funds being provided to support people who were receiving military training or who were otherwise involved with terrorist organizations. That's not the exact language, but that's the essence of it. And I complained about this because we, meaning UNRWA, were doing this every year, and yet it was quite clear we were doing almost nothing to identify such people. We did not ever ask anyone if they were members of Hamas or members of any terrorist organization. One of the Commissioner Generals, when I was there, actually made a statement, which was published in Canadian media, saying, yes, I know we have Hamas people working for us, but it's not something we worry about. That sort of thing concerned me. Some of these things that I mentioned in my paper from 2009 for the Washington Institute had to do with some of the things that are mentioned in the Kelowna Report, actually. And They did not change. I mentioned them to management, but the situation in UNRWA was not receptive to things that were at all critical of what was being done already. And I did not continue doing that during my time in UNRWA. I did it at the beginning. I pointed out difficulties, I pointed out issues, and I was rebuffed, and so I moved on.
I think the record should note it takes a tremendous amount of courage to stand up to what you have stood up to, having been there, seeing firsthand, and then you took a very principled stand to say, this is not the way it should be. So I really applaud that. It's such a principled position.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to exaggerate. I did what I did, but as I said, when my ideas were not received with any sort of pleasure, I didn't make those in the future. Some of the ones that I identified, as I've just mentioned to you, I did raise these issues. I did complain from a legal standpoint that these should not be done this way, but I was rebuffed, so I didn't repeat them.